There are things your mind keeps returning to that most people would forget almost instantly. A small pause in someone's voice, a look that lasted half a second, the way you phrase something, the timing of a reply, the feeling that something was slightly off, even if nothing obvious happened. And once your attention locks onto it, it becomes strangely hard to let go. Not because the moment was big, but because your mind keeps treating it like it meant more than it seemed to. That's what makes this pattern so exhausting. You're not stuck on dramatic events all the time. Sometimes it's the smallest details that stay with you the longest. You notice something subtle, something most people would move past without a second thought. And for a moment, it doesn't feel like much. But later, when your mind has space again, it comes back with more weight. You start replaying it, examining it, trying to understand whether it meant something, whether you missed something, whether there was a message inside it that you didn't fully catch in the moment. And the more attention you give it, the more important it starts to feel. This is how small things become mentally heavy. Not because they objectively are, but because your brain doesn't always measure significance by size. It measures significance by uncertainty. If something feels slightly unresolved, slightly unclear, slightly open-ended, your mind is far more likely to hold on to it than something obvious and complete. That's why the things nobody else notices can become the things you think about the most. Most people assume they overthink because they care too much or because they're too sensitive. But that explanation is too shallow. What's really happening is that your brain is reacting to ambiguity. It doesn't like loose ends, especially social or emotional ones, because those feel unpredictable. And when something feels unpredictable, your mind starts trying to interpret it, organize it, and reduce the uncertainty around it. So what looks like thinking too much is often your mind trying to create certainty where there isn't any. The problem is that certainty usually doesn't arrive. You can replay a moment from 10 different angles, study the tone, the words, the body language, the timing, and still not land on anything final. But because the answer stays unclear, your brain keeps the loop going. It keeps returning to the detail, hoping that one more pass through it will finally reveal what it really meant. And that hope is what keeps the pattern alive. You tell yourself you're just trying to understand it, just trying to get clarity, just trying to make sense of something your mind picked up on. But the more you engage with it, the more your brain learns that this kind of detail deserves attention. It starts marking subtle things as important, not because they lead anywhere useful, but because you keep revisiting them as if they do. And over time, that changes what your mind pays attention to. You become more alert to tiny shifts, more aware of small inconsistencies, more sensitive to pauses, expressions, and vague emotional signals. It can even start to feel like your mind is scanning constantly, picking up on things other people move past, storing them, and bringing them back later for review. That level of awareness can make you feel observant, and sometimes it is. But when it turns inward and loops, it stops being useful. It becomes draining instead. Because noticing is not the same as understanding. And understanding is not the same as control. But when your brain latches onto small details, it often acts as though enough analysis will eventually produce both. It keeps working the detail over in your head as if the right interpretation will settle the feeling underneath it. But most of the time, what you're trying to settle isn't the detail itself. It's the discomfort of not knowing. That's the hidden core of this pattern. It's not really about the look, the pause, the wording, or the tiny inconsistency. Those are just the surface. Underneath, your mind is asking something deeper. Did this mean something about me? Did I miss a signal? Did I get something wrong? Is there something I should have understood in that moment that I didn't? And if the answer doesn't feel clear, your brain stays engaged. This is especially true in social situations, because uncertainty around people feels more loaded than uncertainty around almost anything else. A small shift in someone's behavior can trigger a whole chain of interpretation. Not because the shift itself was dramatic, but because your mind is trying to protect you from being unaware. It wants to know where you stand. It wants to know how you were perceived. It wants to know whether something changed. So it turns tiny details into signals, and then treats those signals like problems to solve. But this creates a trap. The more you try to decode every subtle thing, the more your brain starts assuming that subtle things must always contain meaning. And once that pattern gets strong enough, your mind starts generating significance even when there may be none. It fills in gaps, builds stories, connects fragments, and starts turning uncertainty into interpretation. And interpretation, when it's driven by anxiety, rarely becomes clarity. It becomes distortion. That's why these thoughts often don't make you feel better. They make you feel more mentally tangled. What started as a small detail becomes a thread your mind keeps pulling, hoping it will straighten out. But instead, it just creates more possibilities, more questions, more imagined meanings, more reasons to keep thinking. And suddenly, something tiny is taking up far more space in your mind than it ever deserved. The hardest part is that you usually know this while it's happening. Part of you can see that the detail is small, that the amount of attention you're giving it doesn't match the situation. But another part of you feels like you can't just let it go yet. Because what if it mattered? What if it said something important? What if ignoring it means missing something you should have seen? So even when you know you're looping, you keep feeding the loop. That's why this pattern can feel so convincing. It doesn't present itself as pointless rumination. It presents itself as caution, awareness, preparation, insight. It makes you feel like you're being careful, like you're trying to understand reality more accurately. But if the thinking keeps circling without leading anywhere, then what feels like awareness is no longer awareness. It's vigilance without resolution. And vigilance is tiring, especially when it becomes constant. You start carrying an invisible layer of mental activity everywhere you go. Conversations don't just happen and end. They linger. Expressions don't just pass. They stay in your memory. Small things don't remain small. They expand in private long after the moment is gone. And because nobody else sees that internal replay, it can feel isolating too. You start wondering why your mind can't just move on the way other people seem to. Why something that probably meant nothing can keep pulling at your attention hours later, or even days later. But the answer isn't that your mind is broken. It's that your mind has learned to treat ambiguity as something urgent. And once ambiguity feels urgent, even small details can become mentally loud. That urgency is the thing that has to change. Because the way out isn't becoming less observant. It isn't forcing yourself not to notice things. It isn't pretending you don't pick up on subtle shifts. The way out is learning that not everything you notice requires analysis. Not every detail deserves a meaning. Not every uncertainty needs a conclusion. And not every thought that returns to your mind is pointing to something important. Some thoughts return simply because you trained your mind to return to them. That distinction matters, because if you believe every recurring thought is meaningful, you'll keep following it. But if you start recognizing that repetition is often a sign of reinforcement, not importance, then the whole pattern begins to look different. Your mind isn't always bringing things back because they matter. Sometimes it's bringing them back because that's the path it has practiced. And practice paths always feel easier for the brain to take. So when a small detail comes back again, the shift is not to dive into it harder. It's to notice what your mind is trying to do. It's trying to close uncertainty by force. It's trying to squeeze certainty out of something vague. It's trying to protect you from not knowing. But that protection comes at a cost, because it keeps you mentally tied to things that may not deserve your energy in the first place. And every time you refuse to feed that process, you weaken it slightly. At first, that feels incomplete. You'll still want to go back and examine it one more time. You'll still feel the pull to interpret the detail, to check it again in your head, to make sure you didn't miss something. But if you don't follow that urge, something important happens. The thought doesn't get strengthened. It doesn't get rewarded. It starts losing the extra weight your attention was giving it. And gradually, the detail becomes what it actually was. Small. That's when your mind starts changing its relationship with subtle things. You still notice them, but you don't automatically turn them into puzzles. You stop assuming that every pause, every shift, every tiny inconsistency must be decoded. You let some things remain unclear without turning that lack of clarity into a problem. And that creates peace in a place where there used to be pressure. Because the goal was never to notice less. The goal is to carry what you notice differently. To stop treating every subtle thing like a threat, a signal, or a hidden message you must uncover. To understand that your mind can pick something up without needing to build a whole mental structure around it afterward. And once that shift starts happening, your mind gets lighter. Not because life becomes perfectly clear, and not because uncertainty disappears, but because you stop demanding certainty from every small thing. You stop forcing meaning onto details that may just be details. You stop turning subtle moments into ongoing mental work. And with that, something begins to loosen. The pressure to keep thinking about things nobody else notices starts to fade. And eventually, you realize something simple, but powerful. The thought still appears sometimes. The detail still comes back now and then. But it doesn't hook you the same way anymore. It doesn't convince you that it must be solved. It doesn't pull you into another long loop. It just passes through. And this time, you let it.